The morning light crept weakly through the cracked window of the old kitchen, scattering across the dusty air and broken tiles. On the wooden table, scratched and warped by years of use, stood a single glass, half filled with milk. To most, it would have meant nothing. But to Emily, a 7-year-old girl with sunken cheeks and trembling hands, it looked like heaven itself. Her stomach had been growling for days. Hunger was no longer just an ache. It had become a sharp pain that twisted inside her. Her lips were dry, her throat sore. Since her mother's death the year before, Emily's world had collapsed. Her father, too weak to face his grief, had remarried quickly to Clara, a woman whose eyes were colder than ice. Clara never saw Emily as a child to love, but as an obstacle, a burden she wished would simply disappear. That morning, as silence filled the house, Emily stood in front of the glass, her small fingers hovering nervously over it. She whispered to herself, as if afraid even the walls might hear. Just a little, just a sip. She reached for the spoon, dipped it into the milk, and brought it to her lips. The first taste felt like a miracle, soft and sweet against her tongue. Her chest filled with relief. But the moment of peace lasted no longer than a heartbeat. Clara's footsteps thundered through the doorway. Her sharp voice cut through the room like a knife. "What do you think you're doing?" Emily froze, the spoon still shaking in her hand. Her eyes filled instantly with tears. I was just hungry," she stammered, her voice barely audible. Clara stormed forward, snatching the glass from the table and throwing its contents to the floor. The milk splashed across the cracked tiles, spreading like wasted hope. Emily's chest tightened as if all the air had been stolen from her. "You thief! You ungrateful brat!" Clara spat, grabbing Emily by the arm. "This is my house. You don't touch anything without permission. Do you hear me?" Emily nodded quickly, biting back sobs, but it wasn't enough. Clara's grip tightened. She dragged the little girl across the kitchen, through the narrow hallway, and toward the front door. "If you're so desperate, then go beg on the streets," Clara shouted. The door swung open with a creak. The cold morning air rushed in. Before Emily could plead, Clara pushed her out onto the rough wooden steps. The girl stumbled, her knees scraping against the ground. Emily looked up at her stepmother, her eyes wide with fear. "Please, I just wanted a sip. Please don't make me go." But Clara's face was made of stone. Without another word, she slammed the door shut. The echo rang in Emily's ears like a cruel final judgment. Alone, barefoot, and trembling in the chilly breeze, Emily hugged herself tightly. Her small body shook not only from the cold, but from the crushing weight of rejection. She pressed her forehead to her knees and whispered, "Why doesn't anyone love me?" Her sobs filled the empty street, each one sharper than the last. Passers-by glanced her way but walked on, indifferent, as if she were invisible. A child discarded for nothing more than a spoonful of milk. Little did Emily know, someone had seen everything from across the street. Someone whose presence would change her life in ways she couldn't imagine. And as her tears hit the dusty ground, the shadow of a man began to move closer. If this moment already touched your heart, take a second to like this story, share it with someone who needs hope, and stay with me. Because what happens next will shock you even more. Emily sat on the cold wooden steps, her knees pulled to her chest, trying to make herself smaller, as if she could disappear into nothingness. The street was quiet, except for the occasional creak of wagon wheels in the distance and the barking of a dog somewhere far off. Her tears had left streaks down her dirty cheeks, but she was too weak to wipe them away. Her stomach twisted again, louder this time, almost mocking her desperation. She remembered the sweetness of that single spoonful of milk, how it lingered on her tongue for just a second before being stolen away. That tiny taste had made her hunger even worse. The sound of footsteps broke through her thoughts. Slow, deliberate, heavy boots against the cobblestones. Emily looked up, her big brown eyes widening as a tall figure approached from across the street. It was a man, well-dressed, his coat neatly pressed, his shoes shining even in the morning light. His face carried lines of age, but not the kind that came from anger. They were lines carved by experience, by a life of weight and responsibility. He had eyes that studied everything deeply, and now, those eyes were fixed on her. Emily panicked for a moment. She had been taught not to trust strangers. She tried to shrink even further, whispering under her breath, "Please don't hurt me." But the man didn't shout or scold. His voice, when it came, was calm, almost gentle. "Why are you sitting out here, little one?" Emily's lips trembled. She wanted to answer, but the words caught in her throat. Her stepmother's insults echoed in her head. Thief, ungrateful brat, beggar. She felt ashamed, as if speaking the truth would confirm Clara's cruel accusations. The man crouched down to her level, his long coat brushing against the steps. He leaned closer, but not too close, careful, respectful, as if he knew how fragile she was. "Are you alone?" he asked softly. Emily nodded, hesitant, before whispering. She threw me out." "Who did?" The man pressed gently. Emily swallowed hard, her voice cracking. "My stepmother. I only wanted a sip of milk." At those words, something flickered in the man's eyes, a shadow of anger, quickly buried under a wave of sorrow. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small handkerchief. With surprising tenderness, he offered it to her. "Here, dry your tears." Emily hesitated, staring at the cloth as if it were a treasure she didn't deserve. Slowly, she reached out, her tiny hand brushing against his fingers, and took it. She pressed it to her face, wiping away the salt of her grief. The man sighed deeply, glancing at the closed door behind her. His jaw tightened. "No child should be treated this way," he muttered, almost to himself. Emily shifted uncomfortably, clutching the handkerchief like it was the only safe thing in her world. She had no idea who this man was, or why he cared enough to stop, but there was something in his presence that felt different. He didn't look at her with pity or with disgust. His gaze carried something she hadn't seen in so long: concern. Suddenly, the door behind them creaked open again. Clara's sharp voice sliced through the air. "I told you to leave. What are you still doing here, useless girl?" Her words stopped mid-sentence when her eyes fell on the man kneeling beside Emily. Her expression shifted in an instant, anger replaced by forced politeness. "Oh, sir, I didn't see you there," she stammered, straightening her dress. The man rose slowly, towering over her. His eyes, once warm for Emily, turned cold as he looked at Clara. "Is this how you treat her?" he asked, his voice firm, heavy with authority. Clara forced a smile, though her hands fidgeted nervously. "She exaggerates. Children make up stories all the time. She was stealing, and I was only teaching her discipline." The man's jaw clenched. He stepped closer, his presence intimidating without him raising his voice. "Discipline," he repeated. "You call throwing a starving child onto the street discipline?" Clara faltered, her smile fading. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Emily looked between them, her heart racing. She had never seen anyone challenge Clara before. For the first time in what felt like forever, a small spark of hope flickered inside her chest. The man turned back to Emily, his features softening again. "What's your name, little one?" Emily hesitated, then whispered, "Emily." He knelt down once more, meeting her gaze. "Emily, you don't have to stay here anymore." Those words struck her like lightning. She blinked, not sure if she had heard correctly. Leave? Was that even possible? Clara stepped forward, panic creeping into her voice. "Wait, you can't just..." But the man cut her off, his voice steady and commanding. "I can, and I will. This child deserves better than cruelty." Emily's heart pounded. She didn't know who this man was, or why he cared so much. But as he held out his hand to her, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, maybe ever. Safety. With trembling fingers, she reached out and placed her hand in his. And in that moment, Emily's life began to change. Emily's small hand trembled inside the man's firm grip as he led her away from the wooden steps that had been her prison. Every step felt surreal, like walking out of a nightmare she had thought would never end. She glanced back once, half expecting Clara to drag her inside and punish her even worse. But Clara only stood frozen at the door, her lips pressed tightly, her face pale with anger and fear. The man said nothing at first. His stride was steady, confident, but not rushed. He seemed to know exactly what he was doing. Emily tried to match his pace, her bare feet stumbling against the rough stones of the street. Finally, he slowed, glancing down at her. "Where are your shoes?" he asked quietly. Emily lowered her gaze, ashamed. She took them, said I didn't deserve them. His jaw tightened. Without another word, he shrugged off his long coat and draped it around her shoulders. The fabric was heavy, far too large, but warm. Emily clutched it tightly, as if it were the most precious gift she had ever received. They walked in silence until they reached a sleek black car parked at the corner. Emily had never seen a car like it up close. It gleamed in the light, polished to perfection, its doors taller than she was. The man opened the back door and gestured for her to step inside. "Go on. You're safe here." Emily hesitated, her tiny frame trembling at the thought of entering something so unfamiliar. But his eyes reassured her, so she climbed in, settling into the soft leather seat. It felt like sinking into a cloud. She hugged the coat around herself, glancing out the window as the man circled to the other side. When he sat beside her, the driver, a younger man in a crisp uniform, looked back through the mirror. "Sir." "Home," the man ordered firmly. The car began to move. The engine purred like a beast Emily had never known. She pressed her forehead against the glass, watching the world outside blur. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of returning to that house, because she wasn't going back. After a long silence, the man finally spoke. "Emily, do you know who I am?" She shook her head timidly. "My name is Alexander Reed. People in this city call me many things: businessman, investor, millionaire." He paused, his gaze softening. "But right now, you can just call me Alexander." Emily's lips parted slightly. A millionaire? She had heard the word whispered before, usually when Clara ranted about money she didn't have. But she never thought she would sit beside one, let alone be rescued by him. Why did you help me?" she asked in a fragile voice. Alexander studied her for a moment before answering. "Because I know what it feels like to be abandoned." His words lingered in the air, heavy and mysterious. Emily didn't know what he meant, but the honesty in his tone made her chest ache. She looked down, fiddling with the edge of the coat. The car eventually slowed and turned through massive iron gates. Emily gasped softly as a grand estate came into view. It looked like something out of a storybook, tall windows glimmering in the sunlight, gardens stretching wide, fountains sparkling in the center of the drive. She pressed her hands to the glass, her eyes wide. "Do you live here?" Alexander smiled faintly. "Yes, and until we figure out something better, so will you." Her heart leapt. She turned to him, almost unable to believe her ears. "Really? I can stay?" "Of course." He nodded firmly. No child should wonder where her next meal will come from. The car stopped in front of the massive doors. The driver opened them, and Emily stepped out, her tiny feet sinking into the gravel. She clung to the oversized coat as she looked up at the towering mansion. Inside, the warmth and glow of chandeliers replaced the cold emptiness she had known for so long. The marble floor gleamed under her bare toes. Servants paused mid-step, eyes widening as they noticed the little girl entering beside their master. A woman with kind eyes approached, an older housekeeper named Mrs. Harlow. She curtsied slightly. "Sir, who is this?" Alexander's voice was steady. "This is Emily. She is to be treated as a guest in this home. Make sure she has food, clean clothes, and a room prepared." Mrs. Harlow's expression softened immediately. She bent down, smiling gently at Emily. "Welcome, dear. You must be so tired." Emily's throat tightened. No one had spoken to her like that in so long. Kindly, gently, without cruelty hidden beneath the words. Her eyes filled again, but this time, the tears weren't only of sadness. She was led into a dining room where a table stretched farther than she could see. Food covered every inch: fruits, bread, meats, pies. The smell alone made her dizzy. She looked at Alexander in shock. "All this for me?" He smiled faintly. "As much as you want. No one will stop you here." Her small hands shook as she reached for a piece of bread, biting into it quickly. The warmth filled her mouth, and she let out a tiny sob of relief. She ate as though the world might take it away again, tears streaming down her face. Alexander watched silently, his expression unreadable, but his eyes carried something deeper. Regret, pain, memories of his own past. When Emily finally slowed, exhausted but full, Mrs. Harlow gently guided her to a warm bath and soft clothes. Soon after, she was shown to a bedroom bigger than the entire house she had lived in. A bed with velvet sheets, pillows that swallowed her small body, curtains that shimmered like silk. She sat at the edge, clutching the handkerchief he had given her earlier, still damp from her tears. For the first time, she dared to whisper to herself, "Maybe I'm not alone anymore." And as night fell, Emily lay down and drifted into sleep, unaware that her story was only beginning and that Alexander's reasons for rescuing her were far more personal than she could imagine. Emily woke to the sound of birdsong drifting through the tall windows of her new room. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The sheets were too soft, the ceiling too high, the air too warm. Then she remembered. The car, the mansion, the man named Alexander who had pulled her away from the cold street. Her heart lifted, but just as quickly, fear crept back in. Would Clara come for her? Would she be sent away? She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, her mind trapped between hope and dread. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Harlow entered, carrying a tray of food, fresh bread, fruit, and warm milk. Emily sat up, eyes wide. The housekeeper smiled kindly. "Eat, sweetheart. Mr. Reed insisted you have breakfast in your room today." Emily's lips parted. A whole tray just for her? Her fingers shook as she reached for the glass of milk. She held it to her lips, pausing. Could she really drink without punishment? Mrs. Harlow nodded encouragingly. Emily took a sip, slow at first, then another, until the glass was empty. For the first time, she felt the strange sensation of fullness. Downstairs, Alexander stood in his study, staring at an old photograph on his desk. It showed a boy, maybe 9 years old, standing barefoot in a muddy alley. His eyes were hollow, his clothes ragged. Alexander's reflection in the glass overlapped with the child's face. He exhaled heavily. He knew exactly what Emily was going through, because he had lived it. Years ago, before the business empire, before the wealth, Alexander had been abandoned by his own parents. Hungry, cold, unwanted. He had stolen scraps of bread from trash bins just to survive. And when he saw Emily begging for a sip of milk, the memory of his childhood had come rushing back like a wound torn open. A voice at the doorway pulled him from his thoughts. "Sir, there is a woman demanding to see you. She claims to be the child's guardian." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Clara, bring her in," he said coldly. Moments later, Clara stepped into the study, her face painted with false charm. But Alexander saw through it instantly. "Mr. Reed," she began, bowing her head slightly. "I think there has been a misunderstanding. Emily belongs in my care." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "Care? Is that what you call throwing her into the street over a sip of milk?" Clara's smile faltered. She tried again. "Children exaggerate. She is stubborn, spoiled. I was only trying to teach her discipline. You must understand." "What I understand," Alexander cut her off, his voice like steel, "is that you do not deserve to raise her." Clara's mask cracked. Her eyes hardened. "She is nothing but trouble. And if you keep her, you'll see it too." Alexander stepped forward, his presence filling the room. "If trouble means hunger and pain, then yes, I've seen it. I lived it, and I will not let her live the same." For a moment, silence hung heavy. Clara realized she had lost control of the situation. But before she could respond, Emily appeared at the doorway, clutching the oversized coat Alexander had given her. Her eyes widened when she saw Clara. Clara's lips twisted into a cruel smirk. "There you are? Come along, girl. Time to go home." Emily's body trembled. She shook her head violently, tears brimming. "No, please, I don't want to go back." Alexander placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and protective. "She will not leave with you," he declared. Clara's voice rose, sharp and venomous. "You can't just take her. She's mine by law." Alexander's expression darkened. "If it comes to law, I have the means to fight. But you should think carefully, Clara. If the world hears how you treated her, what would they say?" Clara stiffened. Reputation was her greatest weapon and her greatest weakness. She faltered, then spat. "Fine. Keep the little thief. She'll ruin you too." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out, her heels clattering against the marble floor. Emily burst into tears, clinging to Alexander's coat. "She hates me. She'll never stop hating me." Alexander knelt, lifting her chin so their eyes met. His voice softened. "Listen to me, Emily. Her hatred is not your burden. You are not worthless. You are not a thief. You are a child who deserves love." Her sobs slowed as his words sank into her fragile heart. For the first time, she believed them, just a little. Alexander drew her close, his gaze firm with a silent vow. He had once been that starving boy, invisible to the world. But Emily would not suffer the same fate, not as long as he lived. And so, the man who had built an empire from nothing and the little girl cast out for stealing milk began a bond neither of them expected, a bond that would soon be tested in ways they could never imagine. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The chill of that morning when Emily had been cast into the street slowly began to fade, replaced by warmth she had never known before. At Alexander's estate, she was no longer invisible. She was seen. She was fed, clothed, cared for, not as a burden, but as a child. Still, the shadows of her past lingered. At night, Emily sometimes woke in tears, convinced Clara would storm in to drag her away. She would curl under the blankets, whispering apologies for things she had never done, trembling in the dark. Each time, Alexander was there. He would sit by her bedside, patient and calm, reminding her that she was safe. Sometimes he told her stories of his own childhood, how he too had once been hungry, beaten down by life, left to survive on scraps. How he had promised himself that if he ever had the power, he would save another child from that fate. It was in those quiet moments that Emily began to believe. Not all adults were cruel. Not all homes were cages. Some people, like Alexander, could turn pain into compassion. One morning, Alexander invited Emily into his study. On his desk sat the old photograph of his younger self, the boy with hollow eyes in the muddy alley. He placed it in her hands. "That was me once," he said softly. "I know what hunger feels like. I know what it's like to feel unwanted. That's why, when I saw you, I couldn't walk away." Emily stared at the photo, her throat tight. Then she whispered, "But you're not that boy anymore." Alexander smiled faintly. "No, and neither will you stay the girl who was thrown out for a sip of milk. Your story is not over. It's only beginning." Her eyes filled with tears, but for the first time, they were tears of hope. That afternoon, Alexander made the decision official. Papers were signed. Lawyers were called. The adoption was finalized. Emily was no longer Clara's unwanted stepchild. She was Emily Reed, daughter of a man who had once been broken but had chosen to heal through love. When Clara heard the news, her fury was loud but powerless. She could no longer touch the child she had tormented. Her cruelty had lost. The night the papers were signed, Alexander hosted a small dinner in the grand hall. The table was set not with extravagance, but with simplicity: fresh bread, warm soup, fruit, and milk. When Emily sat down, Alexander poured her a glass himself and placed it in front of her. "Drink, Emily," he said gently. "Not because you're desperate, not because you have to beg, but because it is yours." Her tiny hands wrapped around the glass. She lifted it slowly, remembering the day when a single spoonful had cost her everything. Now, she drank freely, the warmth filling her body and her heart. She looked up at Alexander, her voice trembling with gratitude. "Thank you for giving me a family." He reached across the table, his large hand covering hers. "No, Emily. Thank you for reminding me why I built everything I have. Wealth means nothing if it cannot protect the innocent." And in that moment, both of them understood they had saved each other. The man who had once been a starving boy had found redemption, and the little girl who had once been abandoned had found love. If Emily's journey moved your heart, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Cryspire and help us keep sharing stories of pain turned into hope, of cruelty answered with love, of lives forever changed. Leave a like, share this story, and tell us in the comments what part touched you the most. Together, we can make sure no voice, no child, is ever forgotten.